in the heart of the city, where the cobblestone streets echoed the footsteps of the past and modern hustle, there stood a square that breathed life into the old town. It was a place of convergence, where artists, vendors, and performers mingled with the crowd, each contributing to the vibrant tapestry of urban life. Among these artists was the Mime, a figure draped in black and white, whose presence commanded a quiet corner of the square. The Mime was an artist of the invisible, a sculptor of the air. His performances were a dance of silence, crafting invisible objects and scenarios with the precision of a master. To him, the absence of sound was not a lack, but a canvas, upon which he painted stories that whispered to the soul. Yet, in a world that prized noise and chaos, his art was often overlooked, an old-world novelty amidst the digital age. On this particular day, the square was alive with the usual throng of people, a melting pot of locals and tourists navigating through the maze of stalls and performers. The Mime had claimed his usual spot, a small clearing that had become his silent stage. As he moved with deliberate grace, a small crowd gathered, their curiosity piqued by the man who spoke volumes without uttering a word. Among the onlookers was Leo, a man whose demeanor clashed with the serenity of the Mime's performance. He was loud, his laughter sharp and cutting, a contrast to the quietude that enveloped the Mime. Emboldened by the attention of his friends, Leo stepped forward, his actions fueled by a desire to disrupt, to assert his presence in a space where silence reigned. As Silencio mimed climbing an invisible ladder, reaching towards an unseen prize with a look of earnest determination, Leo stepped forward, his actions fueled by a misguided desire to showcase his wit. With a smug grin, he mimicked the Mime's actions, exaggerating each step with theatrical flourish, drawing laughter from the crowd. Not content with mere imitation, Leo escalated his mockery by pretending to saw through Silencio's imaginary ladder, all the while casting derisive glances at the Mime, challenging him to break his silence. Silencio, ever the professional, attempted to incorporate Leo's interruptions into his performance, turning the mockery into a duel of invisible forces. Yet Leo was relentless. He proceeded to disrupt Silencio's performance further, invading the Mime's carefully maintained bubble of space, and, with a brazen disregard for the artist's craft, Leo reached out to smear Silencio's painted face, a gesture that crossed the invisible line between playful banter and outright disrespect. The crowd, initially amused, began to sense the shift in atmosphere. What had started as a light-hearted jest had morphed into a display of blatant rudeness. Whispers of disapproval mingled with the air, yet Leo, drunk on the attention, failed to notice the changing tide. It was in this moment of heightened tension that Silencio, with a solemn grace, decided to unveil a trick unlike any he had performed before. A trick that would forever alter the course of Leo's life. As the Mime turned his attention squarely on Leo, the air around them seemed to thicken. Silencio raised his hands, framing Leo within an invisible box, his movements slow and deliberate. To the astonishment of all, Leo found himself unable to step beyond the boundaries the Mime had drawn. No matter how he pushed or prodded, an unseen force held him firmly within the confines of the imaginary prison. His movements became frantic, a wild dance of confusion and fear, as he realized that he was truly trapped. The crowd's laughter, once directed at the Mime, now turned on him. Their amusement a cruel echo of his earlier mockery. As the sun began its descent, painting the sky with strokes of orange and pink, the crowd dispersed, leaving Leo alone in his invisible prison. The Mime, with a final bow to the empty square, vanished into the gathering dusk, leaving behind a silence that spoke louder than any words. Leo, now the sole occupant of the silent stage, felt the weight of his solitude. The laughter and jeers that had fueled his bravado were gone, replaced by the realization that he had become the architect of his own downfall. As the shadows lengthened and the square emptied, he understood the true power of the Mime's art. A silence that could bind, a performance that could imprison. And in that moment, under the watchful gaze of a city that never truly sleeps, Leo learned the first lesson of the Mime's silent world. Respect is not given, it is earned. And sometimes, it is taught in the most unexpected of ways. The novelty of my situation had evaporated with the last rays of sunlight, leaving behind a cold, uncomfortable reality. Trapped within the confines of an invisible cage inside the city square that had now turned eerily silent, I felt a profound sense of isolation. My name, Leo, once a badge worn with pride in social circles, now felt like a distant echo of a life I could no longer claim as my own. The square, a place I had navigated countless times with ease and indifference, had transformed into a prison of my own making, a stage for a performance I had never intended to be a part of. The initial visits from the Mime were as punctual as they were unsettling. Emerging from the shadows with the grace of a specter, he would perform just beyond the bounds of my invisible prison. Each night, his silent tableau unfolded with a precision that was both mesmerizing and maddening. His performances, a wordless narrative wrought from the ether, seemed to mock the very essence of my predicament. Despite the growing unease that gnawed at me, my pride refused to yield. I met his silent overtures with a barrage of insults and scorn, a desperate attempt to assert some semblance of control over an increasingly hopeless situation. As the days melded into a singular, unending nightmare, my disdain for Silencio began to waver, replaced by a begrudging fascination. There was an undeniable artistry to his craft, a depth of expression within his silence that spoke louder than any words could. Yet, as quickly as these thoughts came, I pushed them away, burying them under layers of stubborn pride. I was Leo, the man who bowed to no one, who laughed in the face of adversity. I could not, would not, allow myself to be broken by a mime and his invisible box. The mime's nightly visits became the only constant in my world of shadows, a paradoxical mix of dread and anticipation that colored my waking hours. Each performance was a mirror, reflecting back at me not just the folly of my actions, but the fragility of the persona I had so carefully constructed. The man who once thrived on the adulation of the crowd now craved the silent approval of a solitary figure who, night after night, chose to return to the scene of my greatest folly. It was during one such visit that the nature of my imprisonment became painfully clear. The mime had crafted an elaborate scene, a world within the world, and for the first time, I found myself drawn into his silent narrative. My laughter, when it came, was bitter, tinged with the sting of tears I refused to shed. Silencio's performance that night was a poignant reenactment of my own fall from grace, a silent tragedy that laid bare the consequences of my arrogance. Why me? I found myself whispering into the night, a question directed at the silent figure who had become my sole companion in this ordeal. What do you want from me? But Silencio offered no answers, only the continuation of his performance, a silent dialogue that spanned the gulf between us. His presence, once an intrusion, now felt like a lifeline, a connection to a world I had been severed from by my own hubris. "Is this what you want?" I screamed at him, my voice hoarse. "To see me broken? Humiliated?" Silencio paused, his gaze meeting mine, and in the depth of his eyes I saw not triumph, but sorrow. It was a reflection of my own, a shared understanding of pain and regret. But pride is a hard master, and even as my heart yearned to reach out, to make amends, my ego reared its ugly head. With a final burst of defiant rage, I turned my back on Silencio, retreating into the darkness of my invisible cage. With each passing night, the walls of my invisible prison closed in, tighter and tighter. The silence that once stretched between myself and the mime now suffocated me. It had infiltrated the cracks of my bravado, seeping into my mind like a venomous fog. The city square was no longer just a stage. It was an abyss filled with the echoes of my own mockery. The mime continued his haunting vigil, His once intriguing performances transformed into sinister torments. Each movement, each gesture, mocked my powerlessness. Sleep, when it came, was fitful and plagued by nightmares. Fragments of conversations, my scornful laughter, Silencio's silent accusations, they wove together into nightmarish tapestries of humiliation that left me trembling long after dawn. My body became as much a prison as my invisible cage. Hunger gnawed relentlessly, a dull ache that mocked the feast of pride on which I had feasted before this ordeal. Thirst seared my throat like fire. I was reduced to a feral state, scrambling in the dust for scraps, desperately scooping up stale rainwater puddles like a broken animal. Days and nights dissolved into a blurry nightmare. My thoughts turned inward, twisting into self-recrimination. Hadn't I mocked people less fortunate than myself? Hadn't I relished my position even as I feigned humility? The veneer of my carefully crafted persona peeled away, revealing the ugly core of my vanity. Rage followed, a fleeting burst of defiance against the injustice of it all. Surely, this was too much, too cruel a punishment for a mere lapse in judgment. But the rage sputtered out, replaced by a bone-deep weariness. I began to talk to myself, then to the empty air, then to the mocking specter of Silencio. My words, once wielded like weapons, crumbled into incoherent babble. Desperation clawed at my sanity. I imagined elaborate escape plans as pointless as they were frantic. Yet beneath even these desperate fantasies, a terrible truth began to take shape. There was no escape. This was my reality now. The man called Leo, with his sharp wit and confident stride, was gone, replaced by a wild-eyed wretch in an invisible cage. One morning, I awoke to an empty square. The usual buzz of city life seemed distant, muffled beneath an oppressive silence. Silencio was nowhere to be seen. My heart thudded. Had he finally given up? Was this cruel torment finally over? A flicker of hope stirred, quickly snuffed out by a wave of terror. I was alone. Utterly and completely alone. The day stretched into an eternity. My usual tormentor was replaced by a crushing loneliness that threatened to consume me. I screamed, thrashed against the walls of my invisible prison, but my cries were lost in the void. The city had turned its back on me. The universe itself felt indifferent to my existence. As the last rays of light faded, I sank to my knees, my body racked with sobs. Tears streamed down my face, a bitter baptism into a new reality of utter despair. It was in that moment, broken and alone, that I finally understood. Pride had been my armor, but also my downfall. My disrespect towards Silencio was a reflection of a deeper disrespect I held for the world and even myself. And then he appeared. Silencio emerged from the shadows, his usually stoic face etched with a hint of pity? Without his usual theatrics, there was a stark vulnerability to him. My heart pounded with a mixture of dread and a desperate hope I couldn't name. With slow, deliberate movements, the mime lifted his hands, tracing the outline of a door directly in front of me. His eyes held mine, pleading. I hesitated. A lifetime of defiance warring with the abject misery that now defined my existence. Could it be? Was this it? A way out? Or yet another cruel trick? The mime knelt, gesturing towards the invisible door, his hands forming a simple pleat, an offering of freedom, but on his terms. The mime's kneeling form, bathed in the dim light, held an unfamiliar power. No longer the mocking specter of my torment, he seemed, in his vulnerability, almost an equal. A fellow being trapped in a silent world, desperately reaching out. Something inside me snapped. My defiance crumbled, replaced by a gut-wrenching need to be released from this agonizing solitude. Shaking, I reached out a tentative hand towards the invisible door. My fingers brushed against an unseen barrier, a solid coolness that sent shivers down my spine. With a final, ragged breath, I stepped through. The feeling was akin to walking through a thick curtain, a disorienting shift of space. Before me, the city square was as I remembered it, but overlaid with an eerie silence. People moved around me, their voices muted, their laughter a distant hum. It was like a waking nightmare, a return to the world, but forever trapped on its outskirts. I turned, searching. Silencio stood where I had once been, within the confines of the invisible box. As he met my gaze, a single tear rolled down his painted face. And then, the unthinkable. A slow smile curved across his lips. It was not a smile of malice or even triumph, but of understanding and release. The mime stepped through his own invisible door, walking into the world I had just left behind. He moved with newfound freedom and purpose, his silent strides blending back into the symphony of the city. But I was trapped, just as he had been. The mime's gesture wasn't mercy, it was replacement. His amends for my disrespect was to condemn me to his former role. Now, I was the mime, the eternal mockery within the city square. The realization crashed over me. Despite every agonizing step towards repentance, it wasn't enough. My disrespect had left a lasting scar, a stain that required a permanent sacrifice. In my eagerness for freedom, I had condemned myself. Just as the crowd had mocked Silencio, they would now mock me. My pleas would go unheard, my struggles unseen. And with chilling finality, I understood the true purpose of the invisible box. It was not just a means of mockery. It was a mirror, its boundaries forever reflecting my own disrespect back at me.